30 before Christ, in the drowning heat of an Alexandrian summer. A stone chamber stands sealed like a tomb within a palace already half claimed by Rome. Inside, Cleopatra, last pharaoh of Egypt and once the most powerful woman in the Mediterranean world, moves barefoot across cold slabs of stone, her footsteps whispering in the darkness while a Roman guard outside strains to hear whether she is praying, planning, or breaking. For 7 days, she has been locked away, not weeping, not screaming, only the soft drag of fabric, the murmur of a voice that seems to answer someone who is not there. What will unfold between August the 1st and August 12th, 30 before Christ, will not be a tragic love story, but a calculated assault on a queen's mind, designed so that Rome can claim not only Cleopatra's life, but the meaning of her death. Everything most people think they know about Cleopatra's final moments is a comforting illusion. The graceful image of an asp hidden among figs, a queen quietly embracing death in her bed with loyal attendants at her side, survives because it is simple and cinematic, not because it is true. Behind that polished legend lies a much harsher reality, a deliberate psychological operation, crafted by Octavian, that treated Cleopatra as like something to be tested, bent, and finally shattered. This is not the story of a queen who simply chose suicide. It is the story of a ruler forced into an arena where every emotion, every relationship, especially her love for her children, was turned into a weapon against her. And the real question is not how Cleopatra died, but why Octavian needed her to die in a particular way, on his schedule, in a manner that would serve his rise to absolute power. If the hidden machinery of power and control fascinates you, subscribe to the channel and stay with this story until the final breath. This space exists to strip away romantic myths and expose the methods of domination that ancient empires used, methods that still echo in how narratives are built today. For Cleopatra, those final 10 days were not just a countdown to death. They were a confrontation between one woman's determination to retain a shred of agency and a Roman leader determined to script even her final act. The destruction of Cleopatra's world truly began on August the 1st, 30 before Christ. Inside the tomb she had ordered built for herself in Alexandria, a solid stone structure 2 stories tall near the Temple of Isis. Mark Antony lay bleeding, his lifeblood soaking into the dust at its base. He had fallen on his own sword after being told Cleopatra was already dead, a lie that sliced through his resolve as surely as the blade cut his flesh. But Cleopatra was not dead. She had sealed herself inside that tomb, its massive wooden doors barred from within, with her 2 most loyal handmaidens and as much treasure as could be hauled into the stone vault. The place had been designed like a fortress, its walls thick, its access points few, because Cleopatra understood that even in death she would need the same layered protection she demanded in life. Outside, Antony's soldiers were frantic, their shouts bouncing off the pale stone as the Roman general bled beneath the locked entrance. They begged Cleopatra to open the doors, promising safety, pleading for mercy, their voices breaking as they looked from the sealed tomb to the dust clouds where Octavian's troops were closing in. Cleopatra refused. The crack between life and capture had become razor thin, and she knew that unbarring those doors would mean chains, humiliation, and a fate worse than the death already crawling up Antony's limbs. According to Plutarch, Cleopatra and her attendants chose another path. They lowered ropes from a high opening on the upper level, their hands burning as they fed the weight of a dying man through that narrow shaft of air and light. Slowly, grunting with effort, they hauled Antony upward, his blood smearing the stone like a trail marking his last ascent. Imagine that scene inside the dim tomb. The air is heavy with incense and iron, the scent of metal and blood mixing with the dry sweetness of stored treasure. The rope fibers bite into Cleopatra's palms as she leans back with her full weight, the muscles in her arms and shoulders screaming. Antony's armor scrapes the stone, each jerk of the ropes sending another bright splash of red across the rough walls. When his body finally crosses the threshold of the upper chamber, Cleopatra's fine linen is already stained, her breath ragged, her hair clinging to her damp temples. It is there, in that high room of stone and shadow, that Antony dies in her arms, telling her not to pity him, insisting with his last strength that he had been the greatest of Romans, defeated only by another Roman. In that moment, he still clings to meaning, to identity, to some shred of honor. Cleopatra, however, has only minutes to absorb his death before the next storm hits. Octavian's forces did not smash down the tomb doors in a fury of splintered wood and iron. He was not interested in chaos. Instead, he applied precision. Rather than brute force, he sent a messenger, Proculus, to stand outside that sealed stone gateway. Through a narrow gap, Cleopatra's voice carried, controlled but sharp with grief and fear, as she demanded to know what Caesar intended and under what terms her children might survive. She would not open the doors, not without a promise for their safety. While that tense conversation threaded itself through the stone, Proculus's men were already scaling the outer walls like shadows. Fingers searching for cracks, sandals grinding against ancient blocks, they climbed toward the same upper opening through which Antony had been pulled hours earlier. When the soldiers dropped into the upper chamber, the air inside the tomb changed in an instant. The silence broke into a chaos of scraping sandals, shouted commands, and the rustle of fabric as Cleopatra spun to face the intruders. Her hand flashed for a dagger hidden in her clothing, a last thin line of control. She lunged to turn her own body into a weapon, to end the story on her own terms before Rome could touch her. But Octavian's men had come prepared. They crashed into her, rough hands closing around her wrists, forcing the blade from her fingers, pinning her to the stone floor as her attendants cried out and struggled. Cassius Dio describes her screaming that she would not be taken alive to Rome, that she would not be paraded like a trophy, begging them to kill her in that instant. The answer was iron and command. She was to live. That was the order. No blood, but Antony's would be spilled in that tomb. Dragged from the fortified mausoleum, Cleopatra was carried back through streets that smelled of dust, sweat, and the faint bitterness of smoke drifting in from distant fires. The tomb that had been her chosen sanctuary became just another conquered structure as she was transported to the palace and shut inside a chamber on the second floor. One door, one small window, narrow enough that only slivers of hot Alexandrian light could enter, never a human body. Guards stood on the other side of the threshold, armor clinking softly each time they shifted their weight, spears planted like iron branches. Every dangerous object was removed from her world. No knives, no cords, no tools that could be sharpened or twisted into a means of escape. Her clothing and hair were searched with methodical regularity, hands running through braids and folds of fabric, not out of concern but suspicion. Cleopatra, once surrounded by luxury and ritual, found herself reduced to a bare room of stone, a thin mattress, and the echo of her own breathing. But the walls and guards were only the outer layer of Octavian's strategy. Confinement alone would not achieve his goal. Cleopatra's determination to die rather than face humiliation in Rome was as dangerous to his plans as any blade. Death had become her last defense, the only way to deny him the spectacle he needed. So Octavian had to do something more complex than just prevent her suicide. He had to turn her instinct against itself. He had to make her want to live. And to do that, he reached for the most vulnerable part of her life, her children. Cleopatra had 4 children at this time. Caesarion, her son with Julius Caesar, was 17, an age balance between youth and the first hard edges of adulthood. The twins, Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, were 10, still existing in that fragile world where imagination and fear mix easily. The youngest, a boy called Tommy, was just 6 years old. The moment Cleopatra was secured, Octavian's men peeled them away from her, moving them like valuable but dangerous objects to separate parts of the palace. Each child was given guards, but not the kind meant to protect them from danger. These guards were there to make sure the children could never escape, never be used, never vanish. On August 2nd, the day after Cleopatra's capture, another messenger came to the sealed chamber. Not Proculus this time, but Gaius Cornelius Gallus, a man who combined the training of a soldier with the skills of a poet and diplomat. His words were chosen with care, like a blade honed until it could cut without resistance. He told Cleopatra that her children were being well cared for, that their fate depended entirely on her cooperation. If anything happened to her, he said, Caesar could not guarantee their safety. Caesarion, especially, was described as being in a delicate position. The implication hung in the air like a guillotine. If she died, her eldest son would stand alone against a man whose claim to power depended on being Julius Caesar's sole legitimate heir. In that moment, Cleopatra could feel the trap closing around her. Her own death, which had seemed like an act of defiance and dignity, suddenly became a trigger that might doom her children. The stone walls around her were no longer just a prison. They were the physical edges of an impossible choice. If she clung to her resolve and chose death, Caesarion might be killed as a rival, the younger three left at the mercy of Roman politics. If she chose life, if she cooperated, if she allowed herself to be used in Octavian's triumph, then perhaps, her children would be spared. That word, perhaps, became the instrument of torture. From that day forward, Cleopatra lived in the space between two contradictory impulses. Her pride and her understanding of Roman triumphs told her that death was the only way to deny Octavian complete victory. Her love for her children begged her to endure whatever humiliation was required to give them even a sliver of a future. Every breath, every hour in that stone room became a weighing of those two impossible scales: dignity or children, self or blood. There was no outcome in which both could be fully saved. On August 3rd, the pressure tightened in a new, more unnerving way. The door to Cleopatra's chamber opened, not for another speech, but for a small procession of architects and planners. They entered with measuring rods, strings marked with knots, and wax tablets. Their sandals scraped against the stone as they circled her, measuring her height, estimating her weight, taking notes on the span of her arms and shoulders. When Cleopatra asked what they were doing, one of them answered with chilling simplicity. They were preparing for Caesar's triumph. The display had to be constructed precisely to fit her. She was no longer being treated as a queen or even as a prisoner. She was being treated as a piece of living architecture to be slotted into a spectacle. Imagine standing there as they measured you like a piece of furniture. The air feels suddenly colder, even in the oppressive Alexandrian heat. Fingers press lightly against your shoulders, your waist, your wrists, not with affection, but with detached assessment. The scratch of stylus on wax becomes a kind of drumbeat. This is real, this is happening, this is the cage being built. When the architects left, they carried away not just measurements, but a carefully delivered message. Cleopatra had just been shown the shape of her own humiliation. It was not a vague threat anymore. It had dimensions, materials, and a team assigned to its construction. They returned on August 4th, then August 5th, then August 6th. Each time, they brought new questions and refinements, discussing in her hearing what she might wear, which jewelry Romans would recognize, whether chains would be more effective symbolically than visible restraints built into the platform. They debated angles, visibility, and the impact of color and light on the crowd's perception. To Cleopatra, trapped in the center of that planning, every word was like another rivet hammered into the structure of her future shame. The triumph was no longer an abstract ritual in Rome. It was a set of measurements unfolding around her body day after day. This, more than anything, was conditioning. Octavian's team was teaching Cleopatra that resistance was useless, that the triumph was inevitable, that Rome had already moved on to the stage of fine-tuning the details of her public breaking. At the same time, messages continued to filter in about her children. Reports said Caesarion had asked after her, that he was worried, that the younger ones were unsettled and needed their mother. Each reassuring update was laced with quiet threat. All of this depends on you. One hand dangled the horror of the triumph in front of her eyes. The other wrapped itself around her children's throats without ever quite squeezing. Cleopatra was not entirely isolated, but the glimpses she got of those she loved were carefully controlled. Her handmaidens Iras and Charmian, who had braved the tomb with her, were kept in separate rooms. Sometimes their voices drifted through the stone, distorted by distance and the weight of the walls, reminding Cleopatra that she was not physically alone, even if Rome insisted she be emotionally and strategically isolated. She called out, but guards silenced any attempt at conversation. Plans could not be shared. Comfort could not be offered. Every relationship that had once sustained her was turned into a muffled echo. According to Roman accounts, Cleopatra repeatedly asked to see her children, and each time was given the same answer. Not until Caesar was certain of her cooperation. Yet sound does not obey orders. Through the narrow window, she sometimes heard the younger children laughing somewhere in the palace courtyard, their voices light and sharp, rising above the deeper clank of armor and the footsteps of soldiers. The laughter may have been natural, or it may have been deliberately positioned where she could hear it. Either way, it was a form of torture. To know your children are close, to hear them and not touch them, to wonder whether the sounds are genuine or staged for your benefit, is to live in a constant state of emotional disorientation. Modern language would call this learned helplessness. Strip a person of choices, deny them reliable information, make even their strongest instincts feel useless, and eventually they begin to accept whatever the captor offers as the only possible path. Octavian was running that experiment with terrifying precision. By August 7th, Cleopatra reached a point where the tension between her desire for death and the pressure to preserve her children became unbearable. She stopped eating. When guards brought food, she turned away, staring at the stone, letting the smell of bread and cooked grain drift past her. Hunger became another quiet act of resistance, another way to move closer to death without a blade. The guards, trained to report any change, relayed this immediately. Octavian's response was not to have her force-fed. Instead, he used what had become his most effective instrument, Caesarean. For the first time in 6 days, Cleopatra was allowed to see her eldest son. The door opened, and he stepped in, 17 years old, but carrying the fear of someone much younger in the set of his shoulders and the tightness around his eyes. Guards stayed close, hands never far from sword hilts. But for a brief moment the stone room filled with something warmer than strategy. Caesarean begged his mother to eat, to survive, to take care of herself because he and his siblings needed her. His voice cracked on the words, making each plea sound like a promise and an accusation all at once. When the guards pulled him away, the imprint of his presence remained like a hand pressed into wet clay. That night, Cleopatra ate. In that single choice, she revealed the depth of the trap. It was not that she had suddenly abandoned her desire for control over her own death. It was that the face of her son, his trembling words, had made the cost of dying immediately too high to bear. Her love had been weaponized against her. Every bite she took was not a vote for life, but a desperate attempt to keep her children out of the darkness closing in. On August 8th, the game shifted again. Octavian himself came to the chamber. He entered with only a few guards at the door, the quiet confidence of a man who believed he had already won. The room, usually filled only with Cleopatra's breathing and the distant noises of the palace, now held the presence of the man who had dismantled her armies, taken her city, and trapped her in this stone box. Their conversation survives only in fragments through Plutarch, Cassius Dio, and Strabo, but the shape of it is clear. Octavian offered a bargain. If Cleopatra agreed to participate in his Roman triumph, to walk through the streets under her own power instead of being dragged in chains, he would spare her children. All of them, he said, even Caesarean. They would be raised in Rome, educated and guarded, given a place if not full freedom. The alternative was left to hang in the air. Refuse, and Caesarean's life would end with hers. The younger three left at the mercy of Roman politics. Cleopatra did not accept or refuse outright. She asked for time. Octavian, in a gesture that looked like mercy but functioned as another form of pressure, granted her 3 days. After that, he said, They would sail for Rome, with or without her cooperation. Her choice would not stop the triumph. It would only change how she appeared in it and whether her children were alive to watch. Those 3 days stretched like wire. Hope and despair braided themselves together so tightly that Cleopatra could not separate them. Perhaps he meant it. Perhaps, after everything, Octavian saw advantage in displaying mercy to the children of Egypt's last queen. Or perhaps this was one more manipulation, a final twist of the knife to make her betray her own desire for dignity. Each hour, Cleopatra walked the short length of her chamber, the coarse feel of the stone under her bare feet a constant reminder that every step she took was in a cage built for her by another. Then came August 11th, 30 before Christ, the day something inside the structure of Octavian's illusion cracked. The sources do not agree on how it happened. Maybe Cleopatra overheard a careless guard joke about Caesarion's fate. Maybe one of her few remaining allies slipped a whispered warning through the doorframe. Maybe she simply drew on years of political experience, recalling how Rome had treated other threats, and finally accepted what her instincts had been screaming. Octavian would never allow Julius Caesar's biological son to live. The promise of safety had been a mask. The reality was execution. Once Cleopatra understood that her cooperation could not save Caesarion, the balance of her inner scale shifted. The argument for clinging to life so her children might be spared collapsed. The humiliation of a triumph no longer bought them anything. At that point, she requested permission to visit Antony's tomb, telling Octavian she wished to make offerings before leaving Alexandria. It was a reasonable request for a queen in mourning, and he agreed, believing perhaps that she was finally resigned to her role in his story. Under heavy guard, she was led through the city, the smell of the harbor and the cries of gulls rising faintly on the humid air, to the stone structure where Antony's blood had dried on the walls. Inside the tomb, time slowed. Soldiers watched as Cleopatra performed the rituals, pouring libations onto the cold stone, placing offerings, perhaps whispering words only she and the dead man could understand. What they did not see or did not understand was the small but crucial movement when she retrieved a clay vial hidden in a crevice of the tomb, something that had been prepared earlier when she first barricaded herself there. Slipping it into her clothing was a motion practiced over years of palace life, a queen's hands moving with the grace of someone used to managing jewels, scrolls, and secret letters. When she emerged and was taken back to the palace, the guards believed nothing had changed. In reality, Cleopatra now carried the one thing Octavian had tried hardest to deny her, a reliable way to die. Back in her chamber, she asked for a meal. Specifically, she requested figs fresh from the market. The basket that arrived was inspected with almost obsessive care. Guards pushed aside leaves, turned each piece of fruit in their hands, searching for any sign of a concealed blade or vial. All they saw was soft purple skin, the slight give of ripe flesh, the scent of sweetness. They allowed the basket through. Later storytellers would fill this moment with a snake, an asp coiled beneath the figs, the symbol of royal Egypt delivering death in a single bite. But many ancient writers themselves doubted this. Poison hidden in an ointment, a pin, or a vial fits more closely with the controlled, deliberate nature of Cleopatra's character and with the testimony that snakes are unreliable instruments of suicide. What matters most is not whether a serpent struck her, but that she had reclaimed agency over the one decision Octavian could not fully police. August 12th, 30 before Christ. The palace woke under the same dull light and rising heat that had marked the previous days. Outside Cleopatra's chamber, guards heard nothing unusual. No shouting, no struggle, just the steady silence of a woman who had learned how to conceal every visible reaction. Around the third hour, they opened the door to deliver breakfast. The air that met them was still, tinged with the faint smell of perfume and something sharper underneath. Cleopatra lay on a golden couch, dressed in royal garments, diadem set upon her head. The room that had been a prison for 10 days had been transformed by her final choices into a throne room for death. At the foot of the couch, Iras was already dead. Her body had folded where she had fallen, as if exhaustion had finally claimed her. Charmian, the other handmaiden, still clung to a few moments of life. With trembling hands, she was adjusting the diadem on Cleopatra's head, making sure the symbol of kingship sat straight. When one of the Roman soldiers, stunned, asked whether this had been well done, she answered that it was fitting for a woman descended from so many kings. Then she too collapsed. Cleopatra was 39 years old. She had outlasted wars, alliances, and betrayals. But in the end, her victory was measured in the narrow space between being led in chains through Rome and dying in that room on her own terms. This was not a collapse into despair. It was a calculated refusal. For 10 days, Octavian had built a machine around her. He had used isolation, fear, hope, ritual, humiliation, and the weaponization of her love for her children to try to bend her to his script. He wanted a living queen to march at the head of his triumph, proof that he had conquered not just Egypt, but its most famous ruler. Cleopatra's death denied him that. She could not save her kingdom. She could not save her eldest son. She might not even be able to secure a future for her younger children beyond survival. But she could, at the last, refuse to let her living body become a symbol of his victory. Yet even in that, a final cruelty waited. Octavian adapted. If he could not parade Cleopatra herself, he would parade an image. In Rome, during his triumph, a large effigy of Cleopatra was carried through the streets. The queen represented with a snake clinging to her arm, exactly the way he wanted the world to remember her. The crowd saw this constructed Cleopatra, exotic, dangerous, defeated, rather than the woman who had spent 10 days trapped in a stone room wrestling with impossible choices. The propaganda worked. For nearly 2,000 years, the story most people knew was of the seductress queen killed by a snake bite, not the political operator forced into a psychological cage and choosing death when every other option had been stripped away. Caesarion, the son Cleopatra had tried so desperately to protect, did not live long after her. He was killed in the weeks that followed as he attempted to flee toward India, a 17-year-old whose existence alone was too great a threat to Octavian's claim as Julius Caesar's heir. The younger children survived, but survival came on Rome's terms. They were displayed in Octavian's triumph as substitutes for their mother, symbols of conquered royalty reduced to ornaments in someone else's celebration. Later, they were raised in Rome under the watchful eye of Octavian's family, given limited paths in life, never allowed to return to Egypt or rebuild what had been lost. Cleopatra had died believing that, at the very least, her refusal to be paraded alive safeguarded something of their dignity and fate. In reality, Octavian secured everything he wanted: Egypt, the elimination of rivals, and dominance over the story itself. Those 10 days exposed something chilling about how power operates at its most refined. Octavian's goal was never just to remove an enemy. He wanted to dismantle Cleopatra from the inside before her body ever left Alexandria. He turned her love for her children into a lever, her fear of humiliation into a corridor he could herd her down, her hope into a tool to prolong her suffering. He measured her for humiliation, spoke casually about her future display, and offered bargains that were never real, all to funnel her into a narrow set of choices where every path led to his benefit. Even when she managed to slip free at the last second by choosing death, he simply adjusted the narrative and paraded an image instead. Stand in Alexandria today, and the physical traces of these events are gone. The tomb Cleopatra built, the palace where she paced those stone floors, and the chamber where she met death are all lost beneath water and silt, claimed by earthquakes and time. The heat still presses down in summer. The sea wind still carries salt and the cries of birds, but the spaces themselves are ruins or absence. All that remains are texts, interpretations, and the echo of that central question. What does it mean to choose how you lose when every other choice has been removed? Cleopatra chose death over being marched in chains, but her image walked through Rome anyway. She tried to protect her children, but Caesarion was killed. She asserted control over the manner of her death, but not over the story that followed. Those 10 days between August the 1st and August 12th reveal a brutal truth about agency under empire. Sometimes the only power left is the decision of how and when to fall, and even that can be twisted, repackaged, and used for someone else's glory. Cleopatra died a queen, in a sealed stone room with only 2 loyal women at her side, stripped of kingdom and future, but holding onto the last sliver of choice available to her. Whether that choice counts as victory, defeat, or both is a question that still hangs over her story after 2,000 years. Remember these days. Remember the psychological machine that was built around her. And remember that when she chose death, she did it not to save anything tangible, but to protect the one thing Octavian could not seize without her consent, the final decision of her own life. If stories like this unsettle and fascinate you, if you want to keep exploring how ancient rulers were broken not just on battlefields, but inside their own minds, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. Share your thoughts on Cleopatra's final choice, whether it was an act of strength, an admission of defeat, or something more complicated that words can barely hold.